Okay, so today we're diving into a pretty big topic in the web dev world. We're talking about moving from AngularJS to Angular.
Yeah, it's a big one.
It is a big one. And, listeners have sent in some really fascinating articles. There's a panel discussion transcript all about this big transition. And our goal today is to really get down to like the core of why this migration happens. What are your options if you need to do this? What are some of the big things to think about, whether you're a developer or just, curious about how tech changes over time?
Absolutely. I mean, whether you're the one actually writing the code or you're more on the business side, trying to understand the why and the how of it all, or like you said, just interested in the way that technology sort of ages and needs to be replaced, we're going to try and break down the complexity and really highlight what's important.
Yeah, and I think a good starting point is to make sure everyone's on the same page about AngularJS versus Angular. They're not just different versions of the same thing. They're really fundamentally different frameworks. Like think of Angular, which is often called Angular 2 plus. It's a completely new architecture. So it's not like updating an app on your phone or something. It's more like switching from, I don't know, like a gas car to an electric car. There's no simple one-to-one path.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, and that's a really important point to make right up front. When we talk about this migration, it is a significant undertaking, and I think the first question that comes to mind is, why even bother? Like, why go through all of that effort?
Exactly. Why put yourself and your team through that? Well, what really stood out to me from the stuff that listeners sent in is that, for companies that want to stay ahead of the game, stay competitive, keeping their tech current isn't just about, chasing the latest trends. It's actually like mission critical.
It's a necessity.
Yeah.
And moving to Angular isn't just some fad that's going to disappear in a year or two. The advantages that were mentioned in the material that we've been looking at are pretty significant. We're talking about, ongoing support for the framework, a more structured and modular approach to building applications. And that makes them easier to work on, easier to keep running smoothly. And then there's the performance gains. Angular apps just tend to be faster and more efficient.
Yeah.
And it's built from the ground up with mobile in mind, which is, it's essential these days.
Right. And something that came up a lot is how Angular uses components to build the user interface. And this idea of components, it makes the code easier to understand, it keeps it well organized, and it makes it, simpler to maintain in the long run. And then there's the whole ecosystem around Angular, right? There's this huge and really active community, which means if you get stuck on something, there are a lot more resources and people out there who can help you figure things out.
Absolutely. And if you kind of zoom out and think about the big picture, moving to Angular is also about, future-proofing your applications. The team that's behind Angular, they're actively developing it, supporting it, adding new features, new tools all the time. This makes life easier for developers and can speed up development. And we're talking about things like built-in security features that automatically sanitize data, which helps prevent common web attacks.
Right. And this one I thought was really interesting. One of the sources mentioned that Angular can actually perform better because it uses something called ahead-of-time compilation, AOT.
Right.
What that means is that a lot of the work of, getting the application ready to run happens before it even gets to the user's browser. So there's less code to download, there's less for the browser to process, which just makes the app feel faster, more responsive for the people using it.
Right. And that's a really big deal.
It can really make a difference in how engaging your application is.
Huge. And I think it's crucial, especially for folks who are still running on AngularJS, to remember that it's no longer officially supported.
Right.
One of the sources we have here is a podcast. It's from way back in 2019. And even then, they were highlighting this as a major reason to migrate. So the date they mentioned for the end of support, June 30th, 2021, that's obviously passed. But the core message is still so relevant today.
Definitely.
If you're running software that's no longer supported, you are opening yourself up to all sorts of security vulnerabilities.
Right.
As someone in the podcast put it, it makes your company, quote unquote, look dumb to developers.
Right.
And it could potentially lead to a big PR disaster if something were to go wrong.
Yeah, that's a black eye you don't want.
Absolutely not.
Okay, so the why seems pretty clear, right? Better support, faster performance, improved security, better developer experience, and you're future-proofing your applications. But of course, like with any major tech project, there are going to be some bumps in the road.
Yeah, definitely. Some challenges to overcome. The sources we have here touch on a few of the key ones. The syntax, the way you write code in AngularJS and Angular, it's quite different. So developers are going to need to learn new ways of doing things.
Right.
And Angular introduced, some breaking changes, and these can make the migration process more complex.
Right.
And then while it's ultimately, a good thing, Angular has stricter rules, the configuration is more involved.
Right.
It can be a bit of a learning curve for teams that are new to it.
Sure.
And really importantly, you'll probably need to update or replace some of the third-party libraries that your application relies on.
Right.
Just to make sure that they're compatible with Angular.
Yeah, you got to make sure everything plays nice together.
Right.
Okay, so let's dig into the main part of this this deep dive, starting with the strategic thinking and the planning, because that is absolutely critical to make this kind of transition go well.
Yeah. And what's really interesting here is that all of the material we've looked at, it emphasizes that migrating from AngularJS to Angular, it's not just a technical task. It's not just about the developers. It's really a strategic business decision. It needs careful planning, and it needs really good collaboration between the tech folks and the people making the business decisions.
Absolutely.
You can't just kind of jump into this without a plan.
Right. You can't just, wing it.
Right, yeah.
So it seems like the first step is to really get a clear picture of where you are right now.
Right.
You need to understand your AngularJS application inside and out.
Absolutely.
What works well, where it struggles, any kind of tech debt that you've accumulated, any code that's really outdated. It's about taking stock of where you are before you even start thinking about where you want to go.
That's a great point. And along with that, it's really important to set clear objectives for the migration. What are you hoping to achieve by moving to Angular? How does this fit into the company's bigger goals, the product roadmap?
Yeah.
And these objectives, they're going to be, your guideposts throughout the whole process.
Right. You got to know where you're headed.
Exactly.
And of course, money is always a factor, right?
Yeah.
One of the articles pointed out that if you need to purchase new tools, specialized software to help you with the migration, there might be licensing costs involved, and you need to figure those out, get those into your budget right up front.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can't forget about, roles and responsibilities. You need to define who's doing what.
Right.
Whether you have an in-house team, whether you're bringing in outside help, everyone needs to know, who's responsible for what to avoid any confusion and to keep things on track.
Definitely, definitely. And throughout the entire migration process, the sources really emphasize the importance of testing, regularly and continuously monitoring how things are going so that if any problems pop up, you can catch them early, you can fix them before they, grow into bigger issues or disrupt your application.
And even more specifically, one of the articles makes a really good point about doing a security audit as part of your preparation.
Yeah.
Because AngularJS is no longer being updated. Some of the underlying components that it depends on might have, known security vulnerabilities. And,
Right.
and doing a thorough security check, it helps you identify and eliminate these outdated, potentially risky parts before you even move to Angular.
Right.
It's like being proactive about protecting your application and your users' data.
Yeah, like fixing the leaks before you move into the new house. And speaking of things to be aware of before you even get started, one of the articles calls out a very specific technical detail that can trip up developers. Angular doesn't have something called the scope object, which was like this central thing in AngularJS. For developers who are used to working in AngularJS, the scope was everything.
Yeah.
But Angular handles things very differently. So if your team doesn't plan for this, doesn't account for how much their AngularJS code relies on scope, it can lead to, a lot of wasted time, a lot of rework during the migration.
Yeah, for sure.
So careful planning, thinking about the big picture business goals, and also the really nitty-gritty technical details, that's crucial for success.
Absolutely.
So let's move on and talk about, okay, how do you actually make this happen? Like, what are the different approaches you can take to actually do this migration?
Right. So our sources talk about a few different strategies, each with its own, pros and cons.
Hmm.
The first one, and one of the sources kind of dramatically calls this burned everything to the ground, is a complete rewrite.
Right. Start from scratch.
Exactly. You basically start over, rebuild the entire application from the ground up using Angular. And the upside, as one article mentions, is you have a lot of creative freedom. You can completely redesign the application to better meet your current business needs, what your customers are asking for.
Right. But the downsides there are pretty big, right?
They are.
I mean, a complete rewrite, that can take a very long time. I mean, we're talking potentially a year or even more,
Right.
especially if you have a really big, complex application. And of course, the more development time, the higher the costs, right? You might need to bring in more people. You might need to bring
Right.
in, really specialized Angular developers.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's a big commitment.
It is.
The second approach is what's called a hybrid solution. And this is where you essentially run your old AngularJS application and your new Angular application at the same time. And that lets you, kind of gradually replace parts of the application over time.
Right. And the benefits of this hybrid approach, according to our sources, are pretty significant. One is speed. Developers can focus on updating small, self-contained parts of the application at a time. So you can get improvements and fixes out to users more quickly.
Right.
And this is especially important for applications that get a lot of traffic or that, can't afford to be down for extended periods.
Right.
Because you're making changes live, your users get a consistent experience while these bigger changes are happening behind the scenes.
Yeah, yeah.
And another really nice thing about the hybrid approach is you can get feedback from users along the way.
Yeah.
As you roll out, new parts of the application that are built with Angular, you can see how people are using them and adjust your plans accordingly.
Yeah. And the hybrid approach isn't without its potential downsides either, right? One of the sources mentioned that it can still take a significant amount of time, maybe less upfront than a full rewrite. But depending on how long you're running both versions side by side, it could end up costing more in the long run.
Yeah. And within the hybrid approach, the sources actually highlight a couple of specific techniques. One is the what they call the shell strategy. And this involves wrapping your main AngularJS application inside an Angular module. And you do this using a tool called nupgrade. So you can think of it like, putting your whole AngularJS app inside a container that's made of Angular.
Right. And what's the immediate benefit of doing that?
So the benefit there is that you can start building entirely new features, new pages directly in Angular. And you don't have to touch your existing AngularJS code to do this.
Right.
So it lets you kind of move forward with new development using the latest technology while still keeping your current application running.
Got it. Got it.
And along with the shell strategy, a lot of teams use what's called a bottom-up approach. And this means you start by migrating the smaller, more self-contained parts of your application, so individual UI components. And then you gradually work your way up the application structure. So bit by bit, you're switching to pure Angular until a whole section of your application is running on the new framework.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, when you have two frameworks running together on the same page, like side by side, you're bound to run into some tricky situations with how navigation works, right?
Absolutely.
You got to make sure that moving around your application, it feels seamless.
Right.
Even if some parts are using the routing system from AngularJS and others are using Angular.
Yeah, and this is where it can get a little tricky.
Right.
One of the sources mentions that you can run into these, infinite loop problems where, the navigation in one framework accidentally triggers navigation in the other, and it just keeps going back and forth.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and this often happens because Angular and AngularJS, they handle website addresses in slightly different ways.
Right.
So to deal with these navigation issues in a hybrid application, the sources mention a couple of solutions. One is that you might need a special tool in Angular called a custom URL serializer.
Okay.
And this helps Angular understand the web addresses that AngularJS creates, and it creates addresses that AngularJS can understand.
Got it.
Yeah. Another common issue is making sure that when someone navigates in the AngularJS part of the application, the Angular part is aware of that.
Right.
And the AngularJS tool actually has something called setup location sync specifically for this purpose.
Okay.
But one of the sources points out that this might not work perfectly if your application uses, those kind of old school web addresses with the hash symbol in them.
Right.
And in that case, you might need to kind of create your own custom version of setup location sync. Okay. Yeah. Another big technical challenge with the hybrid approach is how to share services between the two frameworks.
Okay.
So services are those parts of your code that handle things like, fetching data from a server or managing user information.
Yeah.
And you might have these pages that you built with AngularJS and you want to move them over to Angular, but they rely on these services that are still being used by other parts of your AngularJS application.
Right. Right.
So the sources describe three main ways to handle this service sharing problem. The the first is to basically just rewrite the service in Angular. So you have two separate versions of it.
Okay.
And this means you have some duplicated code. But it can be, a pretty straightforward solution as long as you make sure all your new development is using the Angular version.
Right.
But it's not ideal if the service is managing, some kind of important shared data or if it's something that gets updated frequently. The second way is to rewrite the service in Angular, but then use a special wrapper to make that Angular service work in your AngularJS code.
Okay.
And the third option is kind of the opposite. It's to add a wrapper to your existing AngularJS service so that your Angular components can use it.
Right.
And then once all the AngularJS code that uses that service has been, migrated over to Angular, then you can finally fully migrate the service itself and get rid of the wrappers.
Right, right. So it's kind of like, do you put the effort in upfront or kind of gradually as you move things over?
Right.
When it comes to choosing whether to create these wrappers to use Angular services in AngularJS or the other way around, somebody in the podcast gave some really practical advice, which is, think about when you want to front load the effort. Do you want to tackle, migrating the service and creating these wrappers like right away? Or would you rather add them kind of incrementally as you move components over, knowing that eventually you're going to have to fully migrate the service? And their advice, seemed to lean towards doing it gradually, keeping the immediate tasks simpler and putting the full service migration on the, on the to-do list for later.
Yeah, it makes sense. And then beyond those two main approaches, the complete rewriter going with the hybrid model, one of our sources briefly mentions Angular Elements as another valid migration path.
Okay.
And this involves taking your Angular components and packaging them as these reusable web components.
Mm-hmm.
And those can be plugged directly into your existing AngularJS application.
Yeah, right. Right.
And then the last thing I wanted to touch on within the hybrid strategies is this idea of hybrid routing or parallel routing.
Okay.
And this is where you essentially divide up the web addresses in your application. And certain sections are managed entirely by the AngularJS routing system.
Yeah.
And other sections are completely managed by the Angular routing system.
Okay.
So it's just another way to kind of slowly transition things over.
Right.
And the main takeaway here is that there's no single, right way to approach this migration. The best path for you is really going to depend on the specifics of your application. How much capacity your team has and what your business goals are.
Yeah, it's a case by case thing.
Absolutely.
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about, okay, so you've decided, on your approach, now what? What are the actual tools that developers are going to be using to actually make this migration happen? And our sources highlight a few key pieces of software here.
Yeah, definitely. One of, I would say, the most important is the Angular CLI. It stands for Command Line Interface. And all of our sources really rave about how useful it is for creating, for managing, and optimizing Angular projects.
Right.
And if you're coming from, those older ways of building web applications, like using things like Gulp or Grunt,
Right.
the CLI is just a much more streamlined and standardized way to set up and maintain your project.
Right.
It provides a bunch of ready-to-use commands for common development tasks.
Right.
It has built-in support for things like checking your code for errors. We call that linting. For running tests, for using a tool called Webpack to bundle your code up.
Yeah.
And someone in the podcast really enthusiastically said, the CLI can save you a huge amount of time and effort compared to, setting up all of these complex build processes manually.
Right. Right.
So it's a really, really valuable tool.
But it's not, I guess it's not always the right tool, right?
Right. And one of the articles did mention that if you have a very customized application or maybe a hybrid application that includes technologies outside of the Angular ecosystem,
Right.
you might need to go back to using, some of the older, more flexible build tools like Webpack or Gulp, just to have more control.
Right, right.
And Webpack specifically is highlighted as a very powerful tool for managing all those different pieces that your project depends on.
Okay, and then there's TypeScript.
Yes.
Which is a really fundamental part of the Angular world.
Absolutely.
The sources really emphasize how it helps make your code more secure, more maintainable by adding static typing.
Right.
So to use TypeScript in an Angular project, you're going to need to use the TypeScript compiler. That's basically a tool that takes your TypeScript code and turns it into JavaScript that web browsers can understand.
Right.
And you also need to enable some specific compiler options called experimental decorators and emit decorator metadata, because Angular relies on those features to work properly.
Right. And those settings, they essentially enable some of Angular's core mechanisms for dependency injection and metadata reflection, which are, fundamental to how the framework operates.
Right. And interestingly, one of the articles mentioned that some web applications out there might already be using, a tool to convert code from one language to another.
Right.
And if that's the case, it might be worth looking into whether you can adapt that existing setup to handle the conversion to TypeScript instead of, starting completely from scratch.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then polyfills.
Yes.
Polyfills play a really important role in ensuring that your application works correctly across different web browsers, especially, those older browsers that might be out there.
Right.
Our sources say that you're likely going to need to configure polyfills to enable certain features.
Right.
Particularly for older browsers like Internet Explorer 11, which might not have built-in support for some of the newer JavaScript features from things like ES 2015.
Right. And then when it comes to hybrid applications, there's this key module called the upgrade module.
Okay.
And it's from this library called @AngularUpgradeStatic. And it's really the core component for getting hybrid applications up and running. It allows both AngularJS and Angular to coexist and work together within the same application.
Right, right.
And there's this method called downgrade component. And that lets you take an Angular component and use it as if it were an AngularJS directive.
Okay.
And then there's upgrade component, which does the opposite. It lets you take an AngularJS component and use it inside your Angular templates.
Gotcha.
And then similarly, there's this function called downgrade injectable. And this is essential for making Angular services available to your AngularJS code.
Yeah.
So it makes it easier to share, logic and functionality between the two frameworks.
Mm.
So, a well-prepared developer is going to use the Angular CLI when possible. They're going to understand the importance of TypeScript, those compiler settings. They're going to configure polyfills to ensure browser compatibility, and they're really going to, learn the tools that are provided by the upgrade module to kind of seamlessly connect AngularJS and Angular in a hybrid migration.
Yeah, yeah. So lots of tools in the toolkit there.
Absolutely.
So let's shift gears a little bit again. Yeah, we've talked about the technical side of things, but let's talk about, the human element here, which is convincing the people in charge, your managers, your stakeholders, why this migration is a good idea, why it's worth the investment.
Yeah. And this is where your communication skills really come into play just as much as your coding skills do. The sources, they really emphasize that you need to explain the benefits of the upgrade in business terms in a way that makes sense to stakeholders. Focus on how it's going to ultimately save the company money or help them make more money.
Right.
Rather than getting lost in technical details that might not resonate with them.
Right.
So, for example, pointing out that Angular and tools like the CLI, they can help speed up development. That's a strong business argument, right? Faster development means you can release new features more quickly. You can get your product to market faster.
Definitely.
And the cost of losing employees who don't want to work on outdated technology is another really powerful point, as someone in the podcast kind of bluntly put it, quote, "I guarantee you've lost employees because they don't want to work on AngularJS."
Right.
And that cost of hiring and training new developers, the loss of knowledge when experienced developers leave, that can really add up.
Yeah.
And they even suggested, using strong language, like saying, our company looks dumb if we're still relying heavily on a framework that's no longer supported.
Right.
And the fact that AngularJS no longer has official support and the security risks that come with that, those are key points to emphasize as well.
Yeah.
The potential damage from a security breach, both financially and to your reputation, that can be a lot greater than the cost of the migration itself.
Yeah.
And you also have to address any concerns that the upgrade could be too difficult or too disruptive.
Yeah.
Emphasize that you can take that gradual step-by-step approach like we talked about with the hybrid migration.
Right.
So you can integrate it into your existing workflows without causing, a ton of chaos.
Right.
And even providing a rough timeline, even if it's just an estimate,
Yeah.
that can help ease any anxiety that managers might have.
Right. And I think one crucial thing is to make it clear that that upgrade doesn't automatically mean a complete, immediate rewrite, because someone in the podcast highlighted how managers often get nervous at the word rewrite because they've been burned in the past by, expensive, unsuccessful, overhauls.
Right.
So emphasizing that in a hybrid application, your existing Angular JS code can often work alongside new Angular code for quite a while. I think that's a really important point to make.
Yeah, yeah.
And then there's this thing called the sunk cost fallacy, right?
Right.
That's that tendency to stick with something just because you've already invested time and money in it, even if it's not the best way forward anymore. And one way to counter that, as one source put it, is to highlight the increasing costs of just keeping an outdated system running.
Right.
They use this analogy of car maintenance. Like, you can either pay for regular upkeep now, or you're going to face, much bigger, more expensive problems down the road.
Yeah, exactly. It's pay now or pay later.
Exactly.
But it's probably going to cost you more if you wait. And be honest, that the first upgrade, that's usually the hardest one. Suggest, investing in training for your team, bringing in, maybe some outside experts who've done these migrations before.
Right.
And presenting the plan in a way that's confident and